Look, I don't know about the numbers, but certainly the British government has been under huge pressure this past week at its height of the exodus from around the world, especially Syria. We have seen the words generous used about Germany and distinctly ungenerous up to now used about the United Kingdom. 4% of refugees have been taken in so far by this country, 40% by Germany. So there's a big difference. What we're seeing is what this government and others are going to have to deal with, and that is the core problem is the war in Syria. And these people are people who are suffering persecution and strife. And what's really important, I think, is that at least this newspaper is using the correct word, refugees. The idea that these are migrants choosing to come over for some economic benefit is really not correct. People. The overwhelming majority, according to the United Nations, are refugees, and we have a legal obligation to protect them. The world does indeed.
Owen. I'm afraid the BBC's been one of the offenders, occasionally using the word migrant when they should be using refugee. But yeah, absolutely right. I mean, you can see here in the Observer, what the Observer has is a number of quite shocking stories of refugees, those who fled terrible conflict, including in Syria. And there's one example here of a woman whose 7-year-old son was killed with shrapnel. Unimaginable horror, which most people in this country, thankfully, will never, ever have to encounter. Now, I think this is important because there's an American political linguist called George Lakoff, and he makes the point the right often use stories to win argument, the left often use facts and statistics. And for many, many years in this country, we've had quite a lot of demonisation, a lot of stigmatisation, negative portrayals of refugees and migrants generally. People like me, I can use statistics. 95% of all Syrian refugees are in neighbouring countries. Lebanon has over 1 million refugees. Turkey has 2 million. We're taking a tiny proportion. But what really matters, the way that
is the individual stories.
It's the stories, the emotional stories. That's how public opinions turn around.
So this extraordinary and very distressing photograph we all know about did seem to be the fulcrum on which everything turned. Do you think that's trustworthy, or do you think public opinion is so fickle? If it can be moved so much by a single photograph, it can swing back, be another story in a couple of weeks' time, which turns people.
Well, it's possible if you have the Daily Mail front page of a migrant or whatever portrayed in a very negative way, an extreme story passed off as representative, possibly. But I think this has to be used for people like myself who want us to be a bit more welcoming of refugees, should be treated as a window of opportunity to build on. And I actually think we could get a bit of momentum. I think for now, this idea of this swarm, as David Cameron called them, they're no longer that. For suddenly now, these are human beings with stories. And I went to Calais myself and interviewed refugees, and I can't. You have to meet these people to understand the horror they're going through.
Not everybody trying to come to this country is a refugee.
But let's focus on them. Let's focus on the refugees, because that's the crisis right now. It really is. Look, Europe is surrounded by real conflict. You've got Ukraine and Russia on one side, and you've got this storm on the south side. And I think
a storm, not a swarm.
Yes, a storm of crisis.
Yes,
of people trying to.
There's a good cartoon about the swarm image. I know we can find it.
I don't know.
Everyone's got it there,
let's find it. But look, about people. Look at this newspaper. These are ordinary people who are helping them. These are ordinary British people, just like the German people who practically welcome them like conquering heroes.
They're giving them sweets as they entered in.
Can we turn to what Cameron was saying earlier in the week, which is that we have to deal with this in Syria. In the end, there has to be a change of policy on the Assad regime. The Telegraph had a very interesting front page about this. Former Archbishop Carey saying we have to start military strikes and so forth. But there's a big Russian aspect to this too.
There is, and yet again, just as all the West may seem to be coming to another consensus on action, the Russian president is doing his best to scupper it, maybe, but certainly to come in on the side of Bashar Assad. This news that nobody in a top position of authority will talk about. We haven't yet had absolute on-the-record confirmation of all of this going on. But, Putin has been Assad's political master. Iran has been Assad's military, and now they're helping.
The suggestion now is that he's effectively going to be Assad's air force.
Air force, exactly. So that's going to create a huge problem.
Big new problem.
Whereas consensus is building, and I spoke to the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, this week, consensus is building that not only does ISIS have to be defeated, you can't contain it, and you can't really just do it from the air, but Assad also has to be part of this equation, and these are two different things, and that there may very well, and I know I'm looking down the road, have to be a ground force of some type to stop this war and to take this out. ISIS
personally,
and Assad.
I think that would be disastrous. I mean, is that the quote of Einstein? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The so-called war on terror began now, 14 years ago, and Al-Qaeda are on the verge of defeat. They're on the verge of defeat.
Al-Qaeda were on the verge of defeat until the Iraq War.
No, but I mean, they're on the verge of defeat by a force more extreme than them. We have jihadis now more extreme than ever. What I'd like to see us talking about is the role of the Gulf dictatorships, which our country are very close to. We arm them to the teeth. The source of extremist ideology from within places like Kuwait and Qatar, funding to these extremist groups, arms. We're not talking about that. Instead, we're still supporting them. I mean, when the Saudi king dies, what do? We put our flags at half-mast instead of looking at their role.
That's really interesting, but I'd like right now to turn to domestic politics, and we'll have no time for that at all. Owen, I called you a cheerleader for Corbyn right at the beginning. That's fair enough, isn't it?
Oh, it's fair enough. I think.
And you've got Andrew Rawnsley, who isn't a cheerleader for
No, I think
Jeremy
I'm the only
Corbyn.
person in the mainstream media who isn't, in fact, opposed to Corbyn in quite a militant way. But no, this piece by Andrew Rawnsley in the Observer, and the point he's making is the opponents of Corbyn, of which there are many in the Parliamentary Labour Party, are taking it as read that he's going to win. And there's a kind of blame game going on amongst them. How did we allow this to happen? The left was supposed to be defeated. I suppose, what I think would be an interesting point to make is what the Corbyn phenomenon has done is filled a vacuum. That the whole New Labour project, if you like, no longer has a coherent vision, an inspiring vision. Whether you agree with Corbyn or not, and if you're in the media, you probably don't support him, but he actually has offered a vision, an optimistic vision, and offered policies.
And it holds together. I mean, it's a world view.
Well, what he's doing, exactly, it's a coherent worldview. You know where you are with what he's saying. And he is bringing together, marshalling these economists to come up with an alternative economic plan. What the challenge is, and I think this is what he needs to do, is how you build a coalition of low-income and middle-income people. He's been talking a lot about self-employed people. 1 in 7 workers now self-employed, no pension rights and so on. I think those policies have been, because we have reduced sister personalities, this whole contest. I mean, he's the 5 times winner of Beard of the Year. There's lots of personalities to talk about. But I would say to people who, the old New Labour stalwarts, look to their own role in this, in the sense, if you had an inspiring vision, this wouldn't have happened, would it?
It's really interesting for us to look at the outside, because we have the same thing in the United States, these sort of outliers like Donald Trump.
People are so fed up with the political establishment.
Bernie Sanders, who's not
world.
quite.
So
But the real question is there a solution? And 55 very prominent economists wrote in the FT that Corbynomics
Well, another few dozen wrote in support, and I think
that's why the 55 wrote in afterwards.
Yeah, well, exactly. We'll probably have 65
I
supporting
would like
next
to
week.
talk with both of you about this Daily Mail story, because that's the other side of public opinion at the moment. A very interesting story there, suggesting that British public opinion is turning against Europe, and partly because of the refugee crisis.
Well, partly that, and I think, we'll see if public opinion, as we discussed, is going to shift in a more welcoming way when it comes to refugees. But the problem with the EU in terms of the support it has in Britain at the moment, it's been eroded not just on the right, partly because of refugees, but also on the left as well. The treatment of Greece, which I think lots of people are very angry about, the destruction of Greece at the hands of austerity, but also, for example, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, which gives corporations far greater power than they once had, a general support of austerity across the EU, a sense that it's very pro-market. So the problem facing David Cameron, he relies on the left and the trade union movement and their organised muscle to help deliver support for his deal. Now, if he strips out the social chapter and other progressive elements
He'll
of
lose
the EU,
all of that.
then he won't have the Tories backing him, he won't have the left, so he has a real
by
problem.
accident, as it were, we could have a government which is, I'm sure, essentially wanting to stay inside the EU. Cameron himself said it does. And George Osborne and so forth, leading us to a situation where actually by accident almost we vote to leave. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's possible that both left and right, there'll be very little enthusiasm to campaign for it, and therefore, that is a possibility.
Last thought from Christiane.
Horror show, by the way, for the rest of the world if that happens. Last the word on the Queen. Well, I know Owen doesn't share my opinion on this. However, she is quite a lady, and 63 years taking over from Queen Victoria on Wednesday is quite something. The whole world basically respects her, except the very tough Republicans.
Hey, I don't not respect
Okay,
it.
good.
It's not fair.
Well, now we have some
Not
commonality here. But the truth of the matter is that unlike, Queen Victoria, many people knew where she stood and what she stood for and what she... Nobody really knows. She's such an enigma.
But also Queen Victoria was
Who
very,
is she? What
very
are her
unpopular
feelings?
for a while. There was a huge
Well, so was this
upsurge
Queen
of
after
republicanism.
Princess Diana died.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
But it was shorter and handled better.
So she's done an amazing job.
I think people do. There is a huge amount of respect. Even a hardened Republican like myself would
And she
accept
brings
that.
people here, by the way.
But that's I suppose the question mark over the future of the monarchy is, can, for example, Prince Charles have the same level of respect and popularity? And
very good question.
Right
to
now we're
end
talking
the
about...
newspaper
There we go.
review on. Both of you, thank you very much.